3 days after my husband's funeral, my son told me the business was sold and my share was $10,000. He didn't know he'd just sold it to me. I stood there like the polite widow everyone expected, but inside I was already counting months of small betrayals and quiet evidence. If you've ever been backstabbed by those closest to you and fantasized about the perfect revenge, like subscribe and comment your own story below, this one's going to hit hard. Stay with me. I'll show you why he did it, how I built the trap in plain sight, and the boardroom moment when everything finally came undone. Morning light always finds the study first. It slips through the slatted blinds in a thin, steady ribbon, catching dust motes that look for a moment like stars before settling back into their honest, ordinary tumble. The room smells of old paper and lemon polish, the remnants of a life that kept its receipts and its memories in neat stacks. On the mantel, Robert's watch rests in its velvet box when he's not wearing it. Now it keeps time for me alone, the tiny metallic click a steady companion in the hush before the house wakes. I make tea in the same chipped mug he preferred, and the first sip is a small ritual. Warmth, the faint bitterness of black leaves, and the momentary illusion that nothing has changed. Robert taught me to notice details. He had a way of reading numbers like others read poetry. A ledger to him was a landscape. I learned to listen when he spoke of margins or patents, when he traced a company history across the back of an envelope. Out in public, I was the gracious hostess, the woman who arranged dinners, who smiled at donors and delivered gentle speeches about scholarships and wings named for generous benefactors. At those luncheons, my hands were steady and my laughter measured. I kept the roses fresh, the napkins folded, the conversation buoyant with charity and nostalgia. No one thought to ask what had been on the pages I ironed the night before, the notes Robert left for himself that I occasionally pretended not to read. Julian was raised on those dinner table scripts. He learned to charm a room the way some boys learn to whistle, polished cuffs, a confident line of jaw, a voice that could slice through doubt and leave certainty in its wake. He loved the applause, the sense that the world bent obediently to his will. To him, I was an accessory to the family brand, warm, unobtrusive, approving. "You're so generous with your time, Mum," he would say with that practiced pity, as if time were a light fabric I could drape casually over my shoulders. He said it as though generosity and ignorance were twins. When the house emptied for board meetings and late-night briefings, I stayed behind in the study. The lamp would throw a warm circle across the desk where I worked, not with the spreadsheets people assumed I didn't read, but with my own meticulous notes. I kept lists of patents and who had signed what, dates inked in a tidy hand. I watched account names, small withdrawals that made no sense, a transfer here, a consulting fee there that seemed to be routed in circles until the numbers blurred into a pattern I could not, in good conscience, ignore. The first time I noticed a missing pension entry, it felt like a paper cut. Small, annoyance made personal, then another and another. Each absence was a quiet theft, easily dismissed in the brightness of the luncheon room, but audible to me in the stillness of my study. One night I heard a voice on the phone through a door I'd left ajar. Julian's, smooth and careless, and something else on the line that the company had never had to explain before. I could hear him laughing too loud and the muted clink of glass. I closed the door without being seen and stood in the corridor with my palms pressed to the wood paneling, feeling the vibration of a life I had helped build, being recited to a stranger as though it were a story he owned. The metallic clink of a filing cabinet in the study downstairs sounded suddenly louder, a percussion to the unease that grew in my stomach like a bruise. The funeral was a blur of faces and measured condolences that smelled of lilies and perfumed sorrow. People said all the right things about Robert, a visionary, a kind man dedicated to his work and his family. They pressed hands and looked at me with the curated sympathy of those who had watched from a distance. In the back of my mind, the ledger in the study hummed like a refrigerator, constant, low, and impossible to ignore. Julian moved through the sympathy like a conductor, directing attention where it served him best. He spoke in polished chords about legacy and the company's future, with that confident air that always made others feel reassured and, more importantly, impressed. After formalities and the last of the guests standing by the hearth with Robert's watch heavy in my pocket, Julian folded me in a practiced embrace and spoke as if addressing a concerned shareholder rather than his mother. The sale has gone through, he said casually, as if he were reading from minutes. Monarch Holdings bought the firm. The deal's closed. My throat went dry as if I had been handed a lemon rind. And your share? I asked, because it was the polite thing to do. He cocked his head with that infuriatingly familiar mix of condescension and charm. It's handled, he said. A little something to tide you over. $10,000 should do. The words landed in me like a stone in a quiet pond. The ripples were small at first, then widening with every thought I had left unspoken for years. In that speech, in that small sum, lay more than math. It was a verdict. It was the summation of a life reduced to a number tossed at a widow for convenience. More infuriating was the assumption behind it. That I would accept. He expected a grateful nod, a proper widow's resignation to the decisions of men who managed the world for her. For a moment, I let the anger roll through me like heat under a winter layer. Then, almost immediately, something colder took its place. The impulse to react theatrically, to shriek or strike or storm, flickered and died. Robert had taught me better than that. You don't overturn entrenched arrogance with fury. You dismantle it with patience and precision. I walked back to the study that evening with the funeral's echo still shivering through the house. The desk light was low, the ledger open to a page I had not expected to read tonight. I ran my finger along columns others overlooked, signatures, dates, a voucher marked in a hand that had been Julian's for the last 5 years. A small entry caught my eye. An odd consultancy fee rerouted through a blank entity. It was the kind of thing Julian would dismiss as routine, the kind of thing the clever would hide in plain sight. The filing cabinet whispered as I opened it, and the metallic clink that had once been background noise now felt like evidence. Each drawer yielded more: copies of contracts with pen marks, an unsigned amendment here, a transfer receipt there. The picture assembled itself with dreadful, inevitable clarity. I sat very still and let the facts align themselves like coins clicking into place in a slot. I remembered Robert's offhand comment months ago when he'd been too weak to argue. If you ever find my name missing from the pages, you'll know who's been reading without permission. He'd smiled, half an apology and half a dare. I had thought him overly suspicious then, an old man fretting over cobwebs. How wrong I'd been. Those cobwebs were the precise threads of a net Julian had been casting for years, and now he had mistaken my absence from the boardroom for ignorance. Grief, I learned, does not erase clarity. It sharpens it. The house felt quieter, not because there was less sound, but because the pointless noises had thinned, leaving only the important ones: the watch, the kettle, the faint echo of my own pulse. I thought of the small indignities that had accumulated over the years, the way Julian corrected me in front of clients as if I were an errant assistant, the time he suggested I step back from patron duties because it's not what investors expect, the way he smoothed conversations to make himself appear indispensable. Each slight had been a stitch taken in a cloak made for him to wear alone. A plan formed, slow as sap but inevitable. Not a dramatic spectacle, not a public humiliation staged for the tabloids. That would have satisfied the passing appetite for retribution, but not the deeper need that had awakened in me. To restore what had been taken and to protect the people whose livelihoods depended on more than Julian's ambition. I thought of the plant floor workers, the engineers who smelled of machine oil and pride, veterans of years who had believed in Robert's vision. I thought of pension checks that should have arrived and had not. Justice, if it was to be meaningful, had to be restorative. The path I mapped in my head required patience and disguise. It needed the obscurity of a maiden name and the silence of small rooms where signatures could be filed without fanfare. It required allies who still remembered Robert not as an icon, but as a man with debts of loyalty. I could feel the shape of it. Minor incorporations here, quiet meetings there, an embrace of the very anonymity Julian used to parade his own cleverness. The thrill of assembling a quiet countermeasure surprised me. It felt like putting together an instrument whose song would be a reckoning. Before bed, I reached for the phone and scrolled to a number I had not dialed in years. Martin Thorne had been Robert's lawyer through decades of triumphs and frictions, a man who had seen the company's bones and remembered whose hands had laid them down. His voice was gruffer than memory made him, kind in the way of someone who understands the weight of things. If you're calling about business, Evelyn, he said before I could even explain, I expected you sooner. I had to grieve, I answered. Now I have to act. There was a pause on the line, the soft inhale of someone who was ready to move from sympathy to strategy. Tell me what you know, Martin said. His cadence told me what I needed most: discretion, competence, an ally who would not mistake emotion for weakness. I told him the small facts that were not yet accusations, letting them hang between us like evidence waiting to be tested. He did not ask for theatrics or assurances. He asked for documents, dates, and a time to meet. When I hung up, the house seemed less like a place of loss and more like a stage for what had to come. The initial hurt had been reconfigured into something colder and sharper, a plan that would be executed with the same care Robert had shown in drafting wing designs and patent claims. Julian had treated the company like a plaything. I would treat it like the legacy it claimed to be. The first move had been made. The first thing I did was change my name on paper. It sounds theatrical said aloud, but it was the practical thread I needed. Elizabeth Winslow on the new formation documents, a name that carried my family's quiet dignity, but none of the social baggage Julian used to discount me. I signed the incorporation forms with a steady hand, watching the black ink settle into the crisp white as if each stroke were a small promise. The lawyer's office smelled of fresh coffee and paper glue. The hum of a copier in the next room sounded like distant rain. Martin slid a folder across the desk, discreet, the kind of thing you don't announce at charity luncheons, and the click of its latch felt like the closing of an old wound. We met in the late afternoons when buildings sighed with the last light. Martin's presence was a ballast. He had known Robert since the company was a blueprint on a kitchen table, and he had the sort of loyalty that had nothing to do with retainer fees. You're doing this tidy, he said once, tapping his pen against the agreement as if approving a fine suit. You're not making noise. He understood silence. He had negotiated quiet exits and discreet acquisitions for decades. The hush of his office, the careful way he poured my tea, made our strategy sessions feel like confessions and blueprints blended together. I opened a small number of accounts under shell entities with names that felt deliberately bland. Winslow Ventures, Autumn Harbor Trust, each routed through banks that would ask the right questions politely, and then let us proceed. There's a peculiar ritual to setting up a company. The typed signatures, the embossed seals, the way a document seems ordinary until it becomes legal. Coffee cups grounded these meetings, their rims stained by urgency. Once, Martin left the cup on a stack of incorporation papers, and I imagined the steam curling up like the first breath of a plan. Monarch Holdings began as a whisper on paper. The articles of incorporation were plain but immaculate. The board slate empty for the moment, our foothold in anonymity intact. I did not want fanfare. Julian thrived on spectacle, awards dinners, press photos, the sort of public performance that made him look indispensable. I wanted the opposite, invisible scaffolding that could be placed under the very stage where he strutted. There were small victories early on that felt like the tipping of dominoes. An electronic filing posted at dawn, a certificate received and tucked into a folder, a registered agent confirming receipt with a perfunctory email. Each tick of progress was a private satisfaction. When the Monarch account finally accepted a transfer, I watched the green confirmation screen longer than I'd admit to anyone. It was not the money that thrilled me so much as the fact that a system I had once watched from the margins could now be maneuvered with deliberate hand. Meanwhile, Julian carried on as if the world were an audience and he the favored actor. He hosted celebratory dinners where the clink of crystal was the percussion of his self-regard. We're expanding, he told the board, with the kind of flourish that made investors nod. New patents, new markets, the Sterling legacy is safe. There were toasts where he lifted a glass and named the team, then smiled directly at me as though to say, "See, I've got this." His arrogance had the rhythm of confidence. It was rehearsed, and he delivered it perfectly. In private conversations, he would lean in, offering that patronizing affection. "You did well with the charities, Mum. Leave the business to the men who know it." I recorded his words in my ledger as if cataloging evidence. The ledger had always been my companion, columns and notes and marginalia that no one ever took seriously because of who I appeared to be. But those margins were where the truth sometimes hid. They held the signatures that had been skipped over, the amounts rerouted to names that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. I began to chart patterns in the company's cash flows, mapping them against Julian's travel and congratulations-filled side dinners. It was a meticulous pastime, the kind Robert would have admired for its patience. There were nights when the house seemed to breathe with tension. I would sit at my kitchen table with the lamp low and stacks of bank statements arrayed like a private constellation. The kettle hissed, and the world outside my windows was simple streetlight and soft wind. I made lists of small inconsistencies and tested them against each other. A consultancy fee here matched a consulting address that couldn't be traced to any real firm. A patent transfer bore a timestamp that did not correspond with board minutes. Each oddity was a whisper that suggested a larger conversation. I would tap my pen and mutter, not aloud but to myself, cross-reference, verify, corroborate. The ritual steadied me. Not everything moved smoothly. There was an accountant, young, eager, who had been handling a tranche of internal audits, who began to ask inconvenient questions about a transfer that seemed to disappear into a shell entity. He called me in, eyes wide with the discomfort of someone who had stumbled upon something messy. "This routing makes no sense," he said, sliding printouts beneath my hand. He could have been a hazard. He could have taken the papers to the board and set off alarms. Instead, I treated him with the same care I used when coaxing a secret from an old friend. I did not intimidate him. I guided him. I asked about his concerns, let him voice his unease, and then gently suggested a course that would allow him to validate the anomaly without raising immediate suspicion. He left feeling acknowledged, and I left feeling the shape of a potential leak plug itself into place. Once, a forged transfer came back flagged when one of our intermediary banks demanded additional verification. My heart clapped a sudden, alarming rhythm in my chest, a lurch toward panic that surprised me. For a breath or two, I saw the plan unravel. A single red flag and the whole slender scaffolding might collapse. I called Martin, and his voice over the line was a steady rope. "Contain it quietly," he instructed. "We file the corrected paperwork, show the legitimate chain, and make the forged item look like a clerical error." He had a way of turning panic into paperwork and paperwork into remedy. The forged document was recontextualized, the alarm subsided, and the impression of incompetence, always useful in hiding intent, settled back over the process like dust. Those near misses carved into my resolve rather than deterring it. If anything, they honed the necessity of discretion. Loud moves would mean exposure, and exposure would hand Julian the headline he craved. I learned the art of appearing small while acting large. I learned to keep my questions low and my signatures precise. I learned the comforting symmetry of legal phrasing and the slow, reliable hum of bureaucracy bending to a determined hand. In the quiet moments between filings, I watched Julian celebrate what he thought were triumphs. He announced partnerships and strategic hires with the ease of someone arranging flowers. He boasted to board members about a rumored buyer whose name he threw around with the careless certainty of someone privy to inside knowledge. "It's the best deal under the sun," he would tell them, his voice brimming with triumphant assurance. "We got a great price. Robert would have been proud." The irony of his invocation of Robert's name did not escape me. He used it like a talisman to sanctify decisions made in his own interest. My internal calculations were patient, not vengeful. I envisioned each piece I set down as necessary to a larger restoration. Monarch's shell accounts, the trust, the registered address that translated to nothing more than a mailbox. These were scaffolds for the day when the business would need a steward who understood its bones. I thought of employees whose faces I had learned at charity events, men and women whose livelihoods should not hinge on Julian's appetite for quick profit. I thought of pension funds with thin ledgers and families who would miss a check if things were allowed to proceed unchecked. There were times when loneliness threatened to become an accusation. The house, which had held laughter and argument, seemed to judge me in its silences. Yet the more secretive the work, the more certain I became that my method was right. I did not crave spectacle, I craved repair. Each document filed in the gray of the afternoon was an instrument of restitution, each anonymous bank transfer a move toward balance. Then, as if sensing the slow net tightening, Julian accelerated. He began to push timelines forward with a haste that smelled of fear under bravado. Board meetings were scheduled earlier. He floated deadlines like challenges and tightened his tone when questioned. "We must close," he insisted more than once, as if speed could outpace scrutiny. The celebratory dinners became sharper, the boasts louder. He bragged about a looming buyer, named names of investors he claimed had been circling for months, and the board, eager for continuity and headlines, nodded in a way that made my skin prickle. The speed was risk and opportunity. It threatened to shorten the distance between plan and exposure, yet it also revealed the exact moment where arrogance tripped over its own haste. If Julian's anxiety pushed him to move carelessly, then his carelessness would be my ally. I resolved to keep pace without revealing momentum, to sharpen our readiness, and to be present when the timing made him vulnerable. The chessboard had shifted, the opponent made a reckless move. My hand was already reaching for the piece that would respond. When I left Martin's office the night he confirmed the final filings, the city had fallen into a low, bright hush. Streetlights threaded the avenues, and the scent of rain promised a clean morning. In my bag, the paperwork for Monarch was folded and sealed, quiet as a loaded hand. My plan had taken shape not as a drama, but as a series of patient legal motions. A maiden name, shell accounts, a careful lawyer's oath, a young accountant soothed into helpfulness, forged paperwork contained, and documents filed with precise accuracy. Julian's haste had become a clock I could read. His deadlines would tell me when to present myself, not as the widow they expected, but as the owner they had not anticipated. The long game was nowhere near finished, but its scaffolding stood. I felt the peculiar steadiness that comes from doing the right thing with the right tools. The hush that had once been sorrow had been reshaped into readiness. The next steps would demand everything I had learned in 45 years of keeping house, reading ledgers, and listening to the rhythms of a company that was as much a living thing as any family. I walked home in the wet air, thinking of the boardroom, of the way Julian smiled when he assumed he could finish what he had started. He would find the end of his gambit far different than he imagined. I set the scene with small, deliberate acts of uncertainty. Monarch needed faces that could be described casually at a board meeting without inviting curiosity, so I asked friends of friends, people with blank resumes and pleasant manners, to play representatives at the negotiations. They practiced naive questions I coached them to ask, the kind that made Julian feel like a veteran in a classroom of novices. When they arrived, they carried satchels that smelled faintly of cheap perfume and new leather, and their hands trembled just slightly when they smoothed papers that had been printed that morning. The courier who delivered an envelope to the Sterling offices wore the same cheap cologne. He hesitated in the entryway as if he had mistaken the door for a more important one. He excused himself with an apologetic smile and a rustle of documents that sounded to my ears like someone riffling through a decoy. Julian, blinded by confidence, supplied lowball figures with theatrical flourish. He handed the Monarch reps a tidy picture of a company stripped of its future value, patents reassigned to shell names, projected revenues dampened by market conservatism, internal liabilities highlighted to justify a bargain price. He spoke of due diligence as if it were a comforting ritual, clicking through spreadsheets with a flourish that made onlookers think he had mastered complexity. He was rehearsed in every way, and that rehearsal was his undoing. The falsified valuations he presented were not maliciously clumsy. They were elegant in their deception, carefully chosen numbers that skimmed the surface of truth and sank all the weight beneath in hidden channels. The rustle of those fake documents, the soft scratch of a pen signing away what was not his to sell, became a soundtrack I listened to with the patience of someone recognizing a familiar tune. In the quiet of my study, I stitched together a different score. My days blurred into a tension-building mosaic. I reviewed contracts under a lamp whose light hugged the edges of the pages. I leaned so close to the fine print that the type blurred and reformed into meaning. I called in favors I had not expected to need, an old bank manager who owed my husband a kindness, an engineer who had once worked nights to perfect a wing and still kept a grudging respect for the company's bones. With each call, I heard echoes. Robert's soft insistence that every bolt had a story. Martin's dry voice reminding me how legal inertia favored those who knew how to wait. Elena's quiet laugh when I asked her to keep a secret. Preparing forensic packets became an obsession with texture. I assembled evidence not as a prosecutor compiling an indictment, but as a conservator piecing together the theft of a house. There were spreadsheets annotated in my hand, dates circled and cross-referenced, email chains printed and highlighted, photocopies of signature pages that betrayed a hesitation in the pen stroke. I learned the difference between an authentic signature, fluid, confident, and a reheated forgery, tremulous, tentative. The forensic accountant I coaxed into the project had a way of annotating documents with small, authoritative strokes that made the margins sing with clarity. He would point to a line item and say, "See that? That doesn't belong." And I would feel the map of deception tighten. Night after night, my internal narration moved between memory and calculation. I remembered the way Robert liked his tea, the way he would tap a pencil against a ledger and say, "Numbers tell a story if you listen." Loss sat beside me like a cold shawl, and grief sharpened rather than dulled my focus. Sometimes in the middle of a forensic review, a memory would bloom. Robert in the garage with oil on his hands, explaining the gentle violence of aerodynamics, the curve of his smile when a design problem yielded. Those fragments of tenderness anchored my wrath, making it less about vindictiveness and more about fidelity. I was not rebuilding a fortune for myself alone. I was warding off a theft that would have broken the lives of people who had given their sweat to a company my husband built with his hands and heart. Montages of preparation played in my head like a silent film, coins dropping into a slot, an old calculator clacking, the tiny green light on a modem blinking patiently, a hand signing a document, and then another hand re-inking the same signature in a manner that did not match the original pressure. I imagined the faces of employees who had trusted Robert's name as if it were a promise. Their trust had been porous to Julian's schemes because they lacked access to the ledger's backstage. I set about building a backstage trap that would catch a man who believed himself above the scaffolding. Execution began to take shape with the same quiet precision I'd used to build Monarch. The shell accounts were primed, the trust vehicles in place, the necessary legal scaffolding erected with the sort of care that turned paperwork into armor. I watched wires clear in the night. Small electronic confirmations arrived like Morse code, a transfer accepted here, a certificate indexed there. Each confirmation was unremarkable on its face, but monumental in context. I did not rush to claim anything publicly. The power of a secret is precisely its invisibility. I allowed Julian to keep his performance, to announce, and to celebrate, while the instruments of my ownership filed themselves into place with bureaucratic deliberateness. The day the sale closed felt both ordinary and epical. Julian stood at the podium smiling with the kind of practiced warmth used to sell confidence to investors. Cameras flash in my memory were just small punctures of light on the room's surface. He announced the figure with a flourish. 13 million. The number landed like a brass bell in a cathedral, resonant, public, irreversible. Applause fluttered like birds. He spoke of safeguarding the company's legacy, of securing jobs, of the stewardship of Monarch Holdings. He distributed platitudes with the same ease. He distributed compliments at galas. Privately, when he addressed me, the performance shifted to condescension. He leaned in as if confiding a mercy, voice low and patronizing. We handled everything, Mum, he said as if describing a household chore. Your share is arranged. It's 10,000. More than enough to see you comfortable. He looked at my hands, measuring them the way one might measure an antique china cup for cracks. The way he framed it made me feel for a moment like a relic he was doing me a favor to preserve. The words should have wounded. Instead, they were calibration. I kept my face a careful plane. There was a conservatism to my response, voice steady, a small, polite smile, and the triumph I felt did not leak into my features. Triumph tasted like a sealed envelope tucked into a pocket. What no one in that room knew, not even Julian, was how the legal lattice I had built had chimed the exact moment the sale would be recorded. Monarch's registrations were live. The routed funds had been cleared through channels that made it appear the company had changed hands in good faith. Julian's supposed buyer was a corporate fiction I controlled. His arrogance helped. He had engineered a narrative that made him the savior of a company he had been steadily siphoning. He had poured convincing words into public ears and left the real account ledgers for those who pretended not to notice. In the swirl of congratulations, I signed a quiet acknowledgement and folded the real acquisition documents into the lining of my leather folder. It felt no less holy than a marriage certificate. I watched him from across the room as he basked, as if the applause were the oxygen that kept his chest inflated. He spoke of employing new managers and retaining staff, and I heard all of it with a kind of detached devotion because every promise he made in public would have to be proven against the ledger I now possessed. There was a peculiar deliciousness to the juxtaposition. The man who had thought he was merely selling a profit margin had, in fact, arranged the transfer to an entity that answered to me. The knowledge was too delicate to vocalize in that room. It needed to be handled like molten glass, kept moving and reshaped only when the time was right. The meeting wound down with the kind of small formalities that feel important only because endings always require gentle gestures. People shook hands and murmured about strategic plans, and Julian's arm draped around a colleague's shoulder with familial theatricality. I stayed measured. I listened and catalogued. My internal monologue was a slow, satisfied arithmetic. The signatures aligned. The tack of the notary's stamp fit the document's edge. The wire confirmations matched the routing numbers I had flagged months before. The shell addresses that had seemed like mailboxes now sat in legal registries. The loose ends I had feared had been tied with the unshowy knot of proper process. When the boardroom's chatter thinned and the last of the perfunctory handshakes took place, I folded my papers with deliberate calm. A sense of completion warmed me, not the wild heat of victory, but the even warmth of a task fulfilled. I slid the Monarch documents back into my folder, feeling the slight ridge of legal weight against cardboard. The act was private and therefore potent. No triumphal words were needed. The ownership existed in paper and registry and the slow, immutable record of banks. It was a small, precise triumph that would, in time, remake lives. As I rose to go, the noise of the room became distant, as if I were walking out of a dream into the ordinary air. Conversations continued, unaware that the axis of the company had subtly shifted beneath their feet. The door of the meeting room swung shut behind me with a soft, final click that sounded, in that moment, like the closing of a long-held secret. I arrived before anyone else. The glass doors were still cool beneath my palms, and the lobby hummed with the polite anonymity of early morning, coffee machines whispering, security scanning badges, the soft shuffle of shoes on carpet. The boardroom windows held the city like a distant painting, light slicing the skyline into quiet plains. Inside, the room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and brass polish, the sort of sterile dignity that pretends not to remember the hands that actually built things. Julian was already there, already smiling as if the day belonged to him. He moved through the room with the easy charm of a man used to owning an audience, his cufflinks bright, his posture perfected. There was a confidence in him that had always been theatrical. Today it looked like armor. I set my briefcase on the table and let my fingers linger on the leather a moment. My voice, when I spoke, would need to be steady. My steps were quiet. Chairs scraped under the soft thud of arriving executives, small talk folded around us, talk of markets and margins, of partnership potential. A clock ticked near the ceiling like a metronome. I took in the scene with the practiced calm of someone who has watched many performances and learned to wait for the final act. When Julian finished with his polished opening remarks, he made the expected motion to the presentation. He tossed names, timelines, figures, slick numbers that sounded like rain on a tin roof. "We've transitioned the company to Monarch Holdings," he told them, voice rich with the certainty of a man who had already decided the story. The board nodded in that automatic way that confirms continuity. He leaned toward me with that patronizing half smile and said, as casually as offering cake, "Everything's handled, Mum." I rose and walked to the table. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Conversations folded into a hush the way curtains draw close. I set my folder down with deliberate calm and let it tap soft against the wood. The sound was small and inconsequential. I met Julian's eyes and asked very simply, "Who is the buyer?" His answer was immediate, practiced. "Monarch Holdings, private investment group, everything above board." He expected the question and had the prepared assurance. For everyone else in the room, his response landed like a bell of certainty. For me, it was a cue. I smiled, a thin, polite thing, and said nothing more. Then, with a motion that was almost casual, I opened my folder. The pages I unfolded had the cool, white sheen of official paper, but the truth they carried was electric. Forensic packages lay there, printed email chains, bank confirmations, timestamps, comparative signature analyses, highlighted line items. The documents had been organized with the clarity of someone who loves order and hates waste. Each piece of evidence sat in its place like a carefully sorted drawer. I slid the first sheet across the table so that the nearest board member could see the header. Monarch Holdings, Certificate of Ownership. The room's air changed. Conversations thinned, mouths closed. "Who exactly represents Monarch?" I asked, and let the question hang like a scalpel. Julian's mask of composure flickered. He opened his mouth and then closed it, as if searching for a rehearsed answer that might still save him. He glanced at his counsel, who offered a distracted shrug that was supposed to signal legitimacy. I pulled out more pages, a routing confirmation from a bank, an indexed receipt, a notary stamp. The forensic accountant's notes pointed to inconsistencies, dated signatures that did not match the pressure and flow of known samples, a marginal note in an email chain that contradicted the timeline Julian had proudly announced. "Monarch is a registered entity," Julian said, voice a touch higher. "The transaction closed last week. The documents are—" He stopped. The first sharp question had begun to dismantle the script. The room stiffened, every head turning as if gravity had shifted. I placed a printout down with the gentle finality of a judge striking a gavel. "This certificate," I said, "is registered to Elizabeth Winslow. The transfer originated from accounts I control. The bank confirmations show Monarch as recipient. The signatures on some of these reassignment pages show hesitation, movements inconsistent with the author's normal stroke." I let the technical details land. They had weight because they were precise. The boardroom felt suddenly too small for its own secrets. Julian's face did something I had not seen in years. The polished smile slipped, not fully, but enough. I watched recognition move across him like a shadow finding its place, an eye widening, a hand brushing at a cuff as if to anchor himself, a brief flush darkening his neck. In slow motion, I saw the tiny betrayals of confidence, a subtle tremor in his fingers, the way his jaw clenched, the slight parting of his lips that had no words to fill it. "You're Elizabeth Winslow?" someone in the back asked, as if demanding a correction for their own senses. I affirmed it with a nod. I felt, for a moment, the odd buoyancy of someone stepping into a room where they had already placed the set pieces. "Yes," I said, "I'm the person behind Monarch Holdings." Silence pressed against us like a hand. Ligaments of power shifted. I watched the board members unfurl astonishment on their faces, puzzlement giving way to calculation, Some looked betrayed, others looked embarrassed for having been so careless. Julian tried to smile again to recover the narrative, but it came out brittle. This is, he stammered. The word mother hovered between accusation and apology, and I felt the history of it like a ledger balancing across my chest. I laid the next sheet down slowly. A forensic analysis comparing Robert's known signatures to a supposed reassignment. The differences were microscopic, but damning. Stroke pressure inconsistent, the hesitation at the cross of a T where none had been before. The forensic accountant's marginalia noted the probability of forgery. I watched the eyes on Julian as if watching a play with a sudden twist. His composure unraveled in the particular way of a man who had assumed control for too long. You sold parts of the company, I said to him, voice even, not loud but carrying. Patents, pension assets, even some real estate holdings, to entities that trace back to shell accounts you controlled. You presented these as necessary measures to secure liquidity and market positioning. You told the board we needed to be pragmatic. The room filled with a low, startled murmur. I held their gaze, one by one, and continued. What you did was siphon value. What you told me was charity. Julian's counsel interjected, words rapid with legal deflection. We can discuss documents in the proper setting, the counsel said, trying to steer the moment back into procedural safety, but the damage was already public. The forensics played like a film that could not be rewound. Board members exchanged looks that begged for distance from the scandal that had just been revealed in their own conference room. My next move had to be both decisive and restorative. I spread out a packet that detailed immediate remedies, restoration of pilfered pension funds, a proposal for an employee stock ownership plan that Robert had once dreamed of but had never managed to implement, and an immediate interim leadership plan to stabilize operations. My voice took on the cadence of someone used to instructing crew in a storm. We will restore the pension liabilities, I said. We will place stewardship in hands that respect both engineering and people. We will appoint Marcus Alvarez as interim CEO while we audit every transfer Julian made. The name Marcus landed like an anchor. He had the respect of the engineers and the quiet competence needed to steady frayed threads. Elena's name, whose mastery of the production floor was legendary, was also included in my list of assurances. The board's eyes flicked from the documents to me and then to each other. Measurement replacing surprise. Practicality settles quickly when money and livelihoods are at stake. Julian rose in a flurry of indignation. You can't just walk in here and... he began, but the words sounded small and thin in the wake of the documents. He tried to rally support, appealed to continuity, to the need for a graceful transition, to the reputational cost of public upheaval. There were board members who flinched at the idea of scandal, others who, reading the forensic pages, recognized the necessity of action. A corporate lawyer sitting at the end of the table adjusted his glasses and asked with hard calm for a recess to review the documents in detail. It was a procedural maneuver meant to buy time. I expected it. I also expected that delay would not undo the visible truth laid before them. I looked at Julian then with that same steady gaze that had once been used to soothe him as a child. There was, for me, no outward relish in his humiliation, only a fierce recognition that justice here had to be precise. There are two paths, I told him. You can resign and face the legal consequences for whatever transgressions our audit uncovers, or you can accept a remedial course that requires you to step away from executive decision-making and start at the bottom of our operations, reporting directly to Elena. Learn the company the way your father did, with hands and sweat and the humility of a craftsman. The breath that left him was both mortified and incredulous. You can't be serious, he said, but the edge in his voice was brittle. That brittleness was a telling admission. The boardroom rippled with reaction, some pious, some privately pleased. The idea of either prosecution or boot camp labor split opinion along lines that had less to do with morality and more to do with risk management. I felt the weight of the moment in my chest. This was not a theater of revenge. It was a courtroom of consequence. I was offering an avenue that included accountability and the possibility of redemption. only if the penitent accepted the cost. My offer was a measured mercy in a case that required remedy above spectacle. Julian looked at me as if betrayed by both his mother and his entitlement. He read the packet and the faces, and perhaps, for the first time, the ledger in his hands that reflected his deeds. Voices rose as the room frayed at its edges, sharper questions, pleadings, legal caveats. The security chief shifted in his seat, conscious of duty and optics. Someone from PR nervously tapped a note into a phone, thinking about statements. I folded my hands and let the chaos find its shape. The truth had been revealed. The rest would be the long, careful work of repair. When I left the room, I did not announce victory. I felt something quieter. The heavy responsibility of stewardship. The click of the boardroom door behind me sounded like the hinge of an old safe, something locked and now opening, slowly, with much inside to be salvaged. The room felt different after the boardroom storm. Less like a stage and more like a factory floor where decisions are measured by rivets, not headlines. I sat at the head of a long table that suddenly felt like a workbench, and I laid out the choices as plainly as I could. There was no theatrical flourish, there need only be facts and consequences. The clack of a nameplate sounded as an assistant slid it across to the interim desk, my name printed with the tidy dignity I preferred, and it landed like a small verdict. In that hush, I described the options available to Julian. He could step down and face whatever legal process our auditors uncovered, or he could accept a remedial path designed not to humiliate, but to teach. The latter option would remove him from executive authority and place him where, in his arrogance, he had never believed he belonged, the production floor under Elena's supervision. When Elena first heard the plan, she stared at me for a long beat, measuring motive and method with the blunt honesty of someone who reads a machine by its worn parts. She did not flinch. She agreed to it on the condition she would have the authority to instruct him like any other newcomer. I remember the sound of her nod as if it were a small machine snapping into place. The idea of Julian learning the company from the ground up felt both delicious and painfully necessary. The hush of the industrial floor that greeted him the morning he arrived under Elena's eye was unlike the polished boardroom. It was a living orchestra of machinery, timers, pneumatic hisses, a distant metallic rhythm that spoke of steady labor. The smell was immediate. Oil and metal and the clean, sour tang of heated bearings. It was honest work that left a residue on skin and pride alike. I escorted Julian there myself the first day, not out of a desire for spectacle, but because a mother's presence is a kind of witness to any serious correction. His designer suit looked absurd against the flaring arc welders and stained overalls. His face had a new openness, the tight, rehearsed smile replaced by an awkward, raw look that lifted and fell like wind-blown paper. Elena handed him a set of safety glasses without ceremony and pointed him toward a line where technicians measured components with tools that had been honed by hand and habit. The clack of a nameplate, this time on a locker bench, marked the practical beginning of his re-education. Restoration was the work that would remedy more than ledger lines. The first thing we announced to the staff was a full audit and an immediate restitution plan. I appointed Marcus as interim CEO. He had the engineers' respect and a steady, practical mind that could soothe panicked investors without sacrificing the workforce. Marcus walked the plant with a quiet seriousness, greeting technicians by name and listening to grievances. He had known Robert and understood the ethics that had underpinned the company's golden years. When the auditors completed their initial sweep, the numbers told a story of small thefts, compounded into systemic damage, pension funds skimmed here, phantom consultancy fees routed there, things no one person could fix overnight, but things that could be addressed if the intention was right. We announced a phased plan to restore pension deficits and to institute an employee stock ownership program, an idea Robert had once sketched, a dream he had never finalized. The plan was practical. Immediate top-up payments where deficits were largest, a trust established to ensure future payments, and a framework for employee ownership that would vest over time. When I told the production line the news, the faces there shifted in a way I had come to recognize. surprise followed by relief, then a steadier, swelling gratitude that felt almost audible. An assembler I had seen at every company picnic, a man with grease under his fingernails and a stoop from years of lifting, walked to the front and clutched my hand with both his. His eyes were bright, as if he had been given back the name of someone he trusted, and a small, guttural sound of thanks left him. He hugged me in public and then stepped back like a man who had scared himself with emotion. I felt the tear on my own cheek and did not push it away. That tear was complicated. It was half sorrow, half relief. It tasted of what we had lost and what we might protect. In the quiet that followed, I thought often about justice as a form of repair. It would have been easier in some ways to make Julian the public villain and close the book. But solvency matters, and people's livelihoods cannot be rebalanced by outrage alone. We made the math transparent. We set up a recovery committee, and Elena's name appeared on every agenda item that related to production oversight. The company began to look like a network again rather than a single, fragile column propped by pretense. Julian's fall was not cinematic, it was granular. Pride, when bruised, shows itself in tiny ways. He had to learn to tie laces without a valet. He had to leave the echo of his designer cuff behind and learn the small vocabulary of hands that have spent a lifetime building. Elena's coaching was unforgiving. She spoke in short, exact sentences and demanded repetition until tasks fell into muscle memory. The first day she stood beside him at a lathe, she showed him how to measure tolerances with a micrometer, her finger guiding his wrist like a teacher coaxing a child into competence. The smell of oil clung to his skin for hours. It stained his wrist and seemed to seep into his bluff, bringing the first honest lines to his face. Elena made no promises about quick reform. She stressed discipline and attention, the quiet virtues that had kept the company afloat through decades of design crises and market slumps. Watching him there, I felt an odd mixture of pride and pain. Pride that he was belatedly learning the dignity of labor that had meaning beyond profit. Pain because he had to be stripped of comforts and entitled assumptions to reach it. I remembered watching him as a child, building models with glue on his fingers, and I wanted to reach across the shop and smooth his hair away. Instead, I watched him as he fumbled and then remembered how to be small, which is often the beginning of being useful. My internal monologue was a quiet ledger of contradiction. Love tallied against corruption. Maternal instinct tallied against corporate duty. I did not enjoy his discomfort, but I felt that the work, awful and necessary, might teach what admonition could not. Small, practical milestones marked progress. A pension check cleared that had once bounced. A veteran machinist found her retirement account topped up and wept quietly at her station while colleagues patted her shoulder. Marcus finalized the employee ownership framework and hosted town hall meetings to explain vesting schedules and voting rights. His tone was plain and reassuring, the kind of voice that reads numbers aloud until they seem human. Julian's first apology came clumsy in public, more of an attempt than a contrition. He approached an assembly crew with a tear in his eye and mumbled words that barely stitched into coherence. Elena intercepted him with a look that was half pity, half steel, and made him sit through a safety briefing he had once thumbed through as a formality. There were awkward moments that felt almost tender. A young engineer who had once cheered Julian's promotions now offered to show him how to torque a bolt properly. Julian accepted the help with a humbling silence that was new to him. The first time he tightened a fixture and heard the satisfying click of a part aligning correctly, his face softened in a way that no press release could manufacture. He came home smelling of lubrication and sweat, a scent that made him more real and less myth. When he tried to sit at the table and join a family dinner later, his hands trembled with the memory of the workday. He made a small, earnest effort to ask how someone's shift had gone, and it sounded like a man trying on a new language. My pride at these small changes was tempered by an ache I could not name. To correct him was to make him suffer, and suffering as a tool for learning is a fraught moral project. I had wanted justice, but I had also wanted repair. Watching him scrub a shop floor after a long day, his sleeves rolled, his face red from exertion, felt both right and sorrowful. The mother in me wanted him softened and safe. The steward in me wanted others protected. The balance was cruel, and holding it made me older in a different way. The employees' responses were varied and human, guarded at first, then cautiously optimistic, then slowly trusting. A longtime assembler who had once been passed over for a promotion because of Julian's favoritism embraced the reality of change and offered a tentative handshake the morning we announced wages adjusted to reflect restored benefits. That handshake was not dramatic. It was ordinary and steadfast, a compact of mutual recognition. The plant, once a place of anxious whispers, began to hum with a steadier, more confident rhythm. Machines ran on schedule, safety logs filled without prompting. It was mundanely beautiful, and Julian, he undertook small acts that amounted to a new curriculum. He learned to file parts, to measure with patience, to listen when someone explained an adjustment. He received corrective critiques from Elena that would have once elicited rage. Instead, he took notes. The first time he admitted he had been wrong in front of a crew, the silence that followed felt like a small church bell. People respected that kind of honesty. It did not erase the thefts, but it began the intimate, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust. Conversations between us became quieter and more difficult. Sometimes, late at night, he would come to my study with his hands still smelling of oil and ask questions haltingly about ledger entries or about why I had not confronted him sooner. I would answer plainly, attempting to hold both accountability and compassion without letting either collapse into sentimentality. He once said, voice raw, that the work had humbled him, but also taught him hatred for what he had been. I did not take pleasure in his shame, but I recognized its potential. Redemption, I told him, is not a single act, but a sustained pattern. It is being present, correcting course, and making restitution over time. Seeds of change grew in small ways. A foreman praised him for holding a tool correctly. A supplier noted fewer errors in a parts list. An HR manager reported fewer complaints about payroll discrepancies. These were modest signs, but they accumulated into credibility. Julian's apologies grew less awkward and more precise. He began on occasion to visit the employee lounge and listen without immediately offering advice. He learned the names of workers he once couldn't be bothered to know. The question that haunted me, quieter than the hum of machines, was whether these small acts would be enough to unmoor habit. Would daily labor and the discipline of craft rewire an appetite sharpened by entitlement? I left the decision for public judgment to the auditors and the board, but I watched the private work with a closeness no report could capture. Watching him earn an honest day's wage did not erase the ledger that had once told of greed, but it began to stitch a new pattern into the company fabric. There were moments of grace, an awkward apology in the canteen, a tentative helping hand on a heavy crate that felt like the first bricks of a bridge. Yet bridges must be walked across and maintained. They are not simply declared. The chapter did not end in neat absolution. The employees had their restored pensions and new ownership structures, but trust, once fractured, takes time to heal. Julian had started to understand what earning truly meant. Not the accumulation of privileges without notice, but the slow accrual of competence, humility, and consistent repair. Whether he would choose that path, sustaining the discipline his first hard weeks demanded, or retreat into old comforts remained my deepest uncertainty. The plant hummed on, a living ledger of work and consequence, and I watched him among the machines, hands marked with oil, and an expression that finally looked like someone willing to learn. Would that willingness be enough? I balanced justice against love and found both demanded a cost I had not wanted to pay. Protecting a legacy meant hard choices, and healing a family required more than triumph. It required patience, humility, and time. The company is steadied, wrongs are being righted, and the fragile threads between a mother and her son have been exposed to light. Whether they mend will depend on daily choices, honest work, and the willingness to be changed. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one.